Okay, so we'll allow the remaining attendees to log on, but we will begin. Aloha, everyone. My name is Mary Awong, and on behalf of the Hawaii Economic Association, welcome to our webinar today. Just going to do a little housekeeping before we get started. As an attendee, you will remain in view-only mode and muted for the duration of the webinar. However, you can engage with the host, panelists, and fellow attendees via the chat function. For questions, please use the Q&A function. All submitted questions will be visible to attendees. We encourage you to upvote questions you'd like to see answered. Our moderator will prioritize questions with the most upvotes and address as many as time allows. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dylan Moore, our moderator for today. Dylan?
Hi, everyone. My name is Dylan Moore. I'm an assistant professor at UHERO, and my focus is on studying tax policy. And I was very happy to be asked to moderate this debate today between our two great panelists about the question of whether or not the government of Hawaii should be doing more or less to promote economic diversification in Hawaii. And this is a question that, on a superficial level, people engage with a lot. I think it's common, especially for the kinds of people who attend these sorts of events, perhaps to have heard arguments about, the government should take a larger role in the economy, the government should take a smaller role in the economy. I think today, though, we have, two panelists who are going to hopefully bring us a sort of fresher perspective. We have Seth Colby from the Hawaii Department of Taxation's Tax Research and Planning Office, and we have one of my colleagues from UHERO, Stephen Bond-Smith, who are both people who have, somewhat more of a sort of detailed background on these things. They've thought maybe a little more about government policy than just, your sort of average, undergraduate level kind of debate about these things would offer. They're going to bring us their perspective from their experience doing research, their experience, in involvement in policy in Hawaii. And I think they're going to have a lot of great things to share with us. They did want me to mention that it's important to keep in mind, they're going to be sort of framing this as a debate, but the views that they express are not necessarily meant to be the definitive views of either one of them or the views of UHERO or the Department of Taxation. But, the purpose here is hopefully to stimulate discussion. And I think, one thing we all agree on is that this is certainly an important topic. And so, these sorts of discussions, I think, are really important to take seriously. Again, the question, should Hawaii be doing more or less to promote economic diversification? Before I talk anymore, I want to point out that we do have a poll that we'd like you to take, where you can express your perspective on the issue as of this moment, before the two panelists have spoken and presented you with their arguments. And I'd like you to take a minute now to finish that poll if you can. Later at the end of the debate, we're going to have another poll, and we're going to see whether or not people's views have shifted as a result of the arguments presented by the panelists. So I'll just give you a minute to please complete the poll. I see we have so far a 70% participation rate. I'll give it just one more moment if you'd like to express a view before we display the results. Okay. Last call. Anyone who wants to complete the poll? All right, I'm going to close it out now. So we had 21 people who participated in our poll, and I think I can share the results. And folks should be able to see them now. I believe that's right. And So you can see that 57% of people, 12 people said they think the answer is yes. 2 people said no, and we have a number of people who are unsure, somewhere in the middle. And hopefully, our panelists will be able to bring you some arguments that, if they don't cause you to revise your views, at least will get you thinking. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker, Stephen Bond-Smith, who's going to be presenting the view in the affirmative. Take it away, Stephen.
Thank you, Dylan. So I'm going to take you through some economic theory, which sort of describes why Hawaii is in the situation that it's in, and make an argument for why that problem can only be addressed by a government intervention. So the source of all economic growth is ultimately about technological change. Now, usually economists will talk about savings and investment or population growth, education. Now, all of these things contribute to growth, greater resource use, greater energy use. All of these things contribute to growth, but they only generate value if there are good opportunities. And the market seeks those opportunities out, right? The market seeks the most valuable opportunities first. But all of those factors of production, they have what we term in economics as diminishing returns. The returns you get on using more and more energy or using more and more investment decline as that increases. So eventually growth stops when it comes to those things. The thing that keeps growth going, the thing that increases returns on investment in capital and labor and and education and so on, is technology. So ultimately, technology is the driver of all economic growth because it's what sustains growth in all of the other things that the market takes advantage of. There's a quote from Paul Krugman that says, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it is almost everything. And what he's talking about here is technology. What he's, total factor productivity is sort of the way we measure technology in economics. And that is ultimately the driver of all growth, even growth from capital and labor and so on. This explanation for growth means that places that invest more in research and development or innovation tend to improve more technology and therefore experience faster growth. And this has been shown empirically and is generally not in dispute. There is some debate between economists about whether or not an increase in investment in research increases growth permanently, or if it is temporary and that it increases growth for a while, but then you've got to sustain that higher investment level in order to sustain those higher incomes. But regardless, it means that more innovation and growth sustains higher incomes and makes those economies better off, right? So all of the arguments around what drives innovation, what drives technology, what drives economic growth point to greater investment in technological improvement. So that's really the first role for governments, is about incentivizing innovation. The private sector still commercializes the innovations and reveals the ideas that have the best value, but governments create the right environment for that to happen, right? Competition actually reduces the incentive to innovate by eating away at the profits. And so governments provide some additional incentives. They give people the right to patent their ideas, they trademark, they copyright. And these types of things allow them to earn extra profits, giving them the incentive to innovate in the first place. Then governments also offer tax credits and various types of grants, and these all provide different incentives for innovation and technology improvement. But importantly, the key input to innovating is not just the effort of those scientists and entrepreneurs and innovators, but the existing knowledge that they're building on. When you invent something new, you don't reinvent all the science that goes into that. You invent the next piece of science. But it also means that when you're inventing that next piece of science, that knowledge can be used by someone else to invent the next thing. And so the benefits of innovating, the benefits of technology growth are far wider than what comes back to the person who owns the patent, to the company, to the entrepreneur that starts that business. These are positive externalities, right? That go well beyond what the market would invest on its own. And so the market tends to underinvest in innovation. And the estimates are something like 2 to 4 times the amount that we invest in R&D would actually be the economically efficient level of investment in technology improvement. And so this means there's a second role for a government, which is about correcting for this market failure for innovation. So even after getting all the settings right in order to incentivize innovation, the amount of innovation that comes through with market forces isn't enough. And so they need to provide isn't enough because of this market failure. So they need to help correct that market failure. And they do this through things like, in particular, things like public universities. So this market failure is greatest at the blue sky stage of research, when that investment in new science and new technologies, doesn't even necessarily have a final commercial application. That means there is no sort of market incentive to invest in those types of things. And so ultimately, fueling economic growth and supporting technological growth requires government investment in academic research and public universities. And so from this perspective, that investment in research and development directly by government is ultimately the fuel or the key driver of economic growth in the long run. But the really important dimension for this in Hawaii is that the access to the background knowledge for doing the science and technology and innovation is affected by geography, right? Knowledge doesn't just disseminate everywhere instantly. That's kind of how economists think about these models, that knowledge is available everywhere, that the economy occurs on a pinhead. But once you start to think about economic geography and you look at the places that are really innovative, what you notice is that it's extremely clustered, right? You have these handful of cities that are extraordinarily innovative, like Silicon Valley in tech industry or Boston in biotech. And so different places really, innovation is extremely clustered in this handful of places. And those are the places that have benefited most from our expanding knowledge economy, right? There's only a handful of superstar cities that are really super successful because of this natural form of what happens with innovation, that it's really driven in only a handful of clusters, right? And this creates something that economists we describe as external increasing returns to scale. So increasing returns to scale you might be familiar with as economies of scale. This is when, as a business gets larger, it can be more productive. And for certain types of industries, those businesses have economies of scale. But external increasing returns to scale is where the productivity of a business depends on the size of the industry. So local productivity depends on the size of the industry, and lots of industries cluster geographically in order to take advantage of this scale. And there are many different examples of this, from tech in Silicon Valley or tourism in Hawaii. Right? Hawaii's tourism cluster is more productive because, well, a business in the tourism cluster is more productive because of the existing size of the industry here. And so economies tend to clusters tend to form of particular industries, but it means that small economies tend to only specialize in a handful of clusters. Maybe only one in the case of Hawaii, that we're really specialized in tourism. But it also means that, and this is really beneficial. It's really beneficial to specialize in tourism. And if you look at Hawaii's economic history, it really thrived in the 70s and 80s, and they had significantly higher incomes than the rest of the US during that period because we clustered and specialized in tourism, which was highly productive due to trends and technologies at that time. And Hawaii was enormously prosperous because of this. But it also meant that Hawaii became vulnerable to any sort of long-term trends or shocks that go against its specialization. Tourism was absolutely smashed by the pandemic, but even in the long-run trends, real tourism spending hasn't really increased since 1990, right? And so when trends go against tourism, we end up feeling the pain of that. And because of increasing returns to scale, we're only specialized in one cluster, and new clusters can never get the scale that is big enough to become established. So it's really hard to transition from a specialization for these small open economies like Hawaii. So this is a market failure that makes it really difficult to establish new clusters and transition between clusters. And our economy becomes over-specialized when our cluster of specialization starts failing. So economic geography creates this coordination or holdup problem that actually prevents market forces from working the way they should. Entrepreneurs are hesitant to invest in new industries until they're absolutely sure that that cluster will reach a sufficient scale. Or they move somewhere else, like to the mainland or California or someone where that place is more suited to innovation, right? And so this market failure prevents a market discovery process from happening and prevents new industries and a diversified economy developing in Hawaii on its own. And if you look at Hawaii's economic history, it shows how this happened, that you end up in this low growth trap where you're specialized in your particular industry. And in order to address that low growth trap, government has to step in. When plantation agriculture wasn't offering the kind of prosperity that it once had, the government invested in tourism infrastructure. It generated huge growth and higher incomes from the mainland by investing in things like Ala Moana, in airports, in the tunnels that go through the mountains around us, right? All of this infrastructure was about getting tourists, making it easier for tourists to get around the islands and making Hawaii a commitment to establishing a tourism industry. And that then gave the consistency for the market to allow a discovery process of investing in hotels and various other attractions that tourists use. So you can find lots of other examples of this throughout Hawaii's post-contact history, where the current activities weren't performing and offering the prosperity that they had in the past, and some major change was required to restart growth. And it's about time for the government to make that strategic push again to diversify and grow our economy. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. I'm going to hand it over to Seth to present his perspective, and then I'll respond a bit to what we just heard from Stephen.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. I just want to point out that only 10% of the people have said that we should do less to support economic diversification. So it looks like I got my work cut out for me today. So let me just begin by being clear about what I'm arguing for and not for, right? I'm saying within the Hawaii's context, the state's #1 priority should be doing less, not to be doing more to promote economic diversification. One of the things that we often lack when we're talking about economic strategies within Hawaii is clear definitions. And I think it's very important to have clear definitions about what we're talking about. So we're talking about industrial promotion, like expanding, changing Hawaii's economic profile and having it that a somewhat government-led or at least a government-assisted approach, right? That's what we're talking about. So that is industrial policy in some degree in the economic literature. What I'm not talking about is if some company wants to show up and say, if NVIDIA wants to come and create a chip plant in Hawaii, they can definitely call up the governor, and the governor will definitely talk to DBED, and they will facilitate that and make sure all the things go well, right? So being accommodative to business investment is not what I'm talking about here, nor is it basic infrastructure, right? So I'm not contending that we shouldn't build, the government should build roads or even a port once in a while, even though we get into iffy, sometimes we can get into iffy areas in terms of industrial parks and things like that. So we can talk about areas like that later. But what I'm really talking about is helping Hawaii find and discover new industries, right? And so my argument will be that we should be doing less and not more. So before I start out with an economic argument, I'd like to talk about a philosophical argument, which is David Hume's is-ought problem, right? So David Hume was this famous philosopher in the Scottish philosopher in the 1700s, and he had this whole argument that was is-ought. So just because something is a certain way does not mean you ought to do something different or do that way, right? So this is the whole idea that every single descriptive claim entails a prescriptive claim, or a descriptive observation entails a prescriptive claim. So what do I mean by that? So just because we have two major industries in Hawaii, the government or military and tourism, does not necessarily mean that we need to diversify. It could mean we need to be diversify, or it could not, but it doesn't necessarily say that requirement. So you need an additional argument to say, should you do that, right? And that's what I'm going to be arguing today. So a couple is-ought fallacies that are in there all around us, right? So a lot of times you hear that, oh, like a basic one you'll hear in a philosophy class is, we evolved to eat meat, so then we should eat meat, right? But those are two different things, right? Like just a descriptive analysis of the human anatomy doesn't entail, like, make the more argument for eating meat or against it. But in Hawaii, we do it all the time. When anybody hears that we import 90% of our food, a lot of people say, no, that we can't do that. We need to import more, or we need to import or grow more ourselves. Now, That, again, I'm not contending one way or the other, but just because we import 90% of food doesn't mean we need to do anything. The same way with our industrial promotion, right? Just because we have a certain industrial makeup does not entail that we need to do one thing or the other. Yes, there are benefits to economic diversification, and we can talk about those, but we need to weigh the that in a very systematic and hopefully an economically insightful way. So when I'm talking about what we need to do, we need to do two things. We need to diagnose the problem, right? What is the problem going on? And then second of all, do we have the capacity to actually solve the problem, right? So just because there is a problem does not necessarily always entail that you need to do something to do or to solve it, especially the government, because the government, as we will look at, does not always have the track record to solve every single problem. So as we're talking all the way through, rather than like thinking about what we need to do and what we do, I think it's very helpful to like articulate a model of what we need to do first and then go forward from there. So let's think about industrial policy, right? What is the market failure? Now, anytime people say that there's a market failure, you got to be really careful with economists because there's lots of consultancies around the world that will just show up and say, hey, I have a problem, and I can come up with a market failure to back it up. What makes economics special is we have the theory, but we also have the needs to empirically back it up. So if there is a market failure, we need to show it. We just can't talk about, yeah, there's a market failure someplace else. And then additionally, we need to show that we can solve that. So what is the market failure in this problem, right? Another way to think about that is what price is wrong? Why don't investor know, why does the government know better to invest in something than what the private business does? There's possibilities to that. There's coordination problems, as Stephen pointed out, but we just don't know what it is. And so it's upon anybody who's going to try to get the government to do something, it's imposed on them to come up with actually what the price is wrong. And when you think about the price, like why is the return not high enough, or what that it is, in like, I think that's very insightful. But more than that, you have to think about, does the government know more than investors? So, because that's essentially what you're arguing. And the problem is, not only does the government need to know more than investors, it has to act just as well as an investor. So it has to act nimbly and quickly, has to have high levels of accountability and high degrees of independence. One of the problems that we've seen here in Hawaii is when you do an industrial promotion, it creates constituencies that are prone to capture. And that includes businesses, which always come back and say, no, we can't, we need the government subsidy to last a little bit longer, or else we're not going to do well, and also within the government. So we have tons of economic industrial promotion activities within our government, but we never look at, and all of them have the incentive to always say, oh, we need to do a little bit more. We need to do a little more. Oh, I'm providing jobs, things like that. But we don't really have the accountability mechanisms to do that. The second of all is industrial promotion is one of the hardest things that a government can ever do, right? Because you're trying to do something that the private sector cannot do. So when we do this, one of the things we have to always ask is, how high is our state capacity here in Hawaii? Now, we would argue it's probably pretty low, right? For one thing, Hawaii is not known for a government efficiency. We don't offer salaries that are competitive with the private sector. If you want to look at more objective metrics, Hawaii has ranks in states. When we get federal funding, we're more likely to, we're one of the states most likely to have to give it back. So we are least efficient in using federal funds. And another one is, let's look at our past examples of industrial promotion. So the famous one is the high technology business investment tax credit, which cost the state $950 million. So almost $1 billion in tax credits to change our industrial profile, and it did not do anything, right? Look at what we're doing right now with the qualified tech credit. So that's the tech credit where we're give money to solve this information problem, right? But how are we structuring it? Well, right now, all the businesses compete in a lottery-like mechanisms for $5 million, and it's distributed at random. That type of approach does not change business behavior or facilitate things. So we do not have a good track record of how to do things. Second of all, I totally agree with Stephen in terms that there's coordination problems and research is important, but we do have industrial policy available to local businesses through our national government, right? So the NSH, the DARPA, science grants, Hawaii's can apply for those things here in Hawaii. So that's if, should we do it? Now the question is, my whole point is, should we do less? And my thing is, Hawaii has had a long history of businesses investigating and trying to do new industries. And the problem is we tend to kill them, right? So think of TMT, think of the Kahuku wind farms, think of geothermal power, dairy farms on Kauai. These were all ideas promoted by industrial promotion or entrepreneurs, but we stopped that because of the high, because we have high business risk, regulatory risk in Hawaii. And so by doing less, meaning we get involved in less in business decisions, I think it would do more to like facilitate economic growth and economic diversification, because we would give entrepreneurs the idea to engage in price discovery and not government. And two things I want to finish with is, one is when you're thinking about Hawaii, let's move away from economic theories and think like a hard-nosed business environment investor. So in discounted cash flow analysis, you think that's how you decide if you're going to make an investment. If you're going to make an investment first, you got to look at the cash flow. Well, our problem is everything costs so much in Hawaii, and so your cash flow is less, right? So if we lower our business costs, the cost of doing business here in Hawaii, then we would increase investment and price discovery. And on the other side, you know, we have a high like risk premium here in Hawaii because we have our regulatory burdens changes all the time, right? So if we lower that, we would help make investments more profitable, more viable, and then we could have more price discovery that way. So my argument is not that we should be doing, the government needs to be doing more, we should be doing less, so like we can allow entrepreneurs to discover this and engage in price discovery. Just a couple of things, you know, when we talk about clusters happen on their own. We don't need government to promote clusters, right? So this is the whole idea, like a lot of these ideas, when we come up with it, it's like, oh, clusters are really important, so our government needs to promote more clusters. But sometimes it's way better just to let the clusters emerge on their own. You know, these, you know, like these clusters that Stephen was talking about in New York, Silicon Valley, we have this, a cluster here. Those really happened on their own. They're very much led by the private sector. So you have to think, what aspect of the government needs to be doing something in addition to that? And I would argue that the best way that we can support this price discovery and things is to be doing less. Let's move out of the price. Let's stop being one of the worst business climates in the country, right? Let's start allowing businesses to be profitable. And if they are successful, we shouldn't tax them to death. That would be my approach. So I will stop there.
Okay, Seth incorporated into his discussion some responses to Stephen. So we're going to give Stephen now a few minutes to respond to some of Seth's arguments, and then we'll transition into a sort of question and answer discussion. Take it away, Stephen.
Thanks, Dylan. Thanks for your arguments, Seth. Look, you made the question, you know, just because we have two industries, military and tourism, doesn't mean we need to diversify, and I totally agree. You know, the premise that we need to diversify is really based, I think, on the economic performance of Hawaii over the last 3 decades. Growth is completely stagnant. You know, the normal state of an economy is growth. Returns on investment in technology, they increase future incomes, and they increase them enough that we're willing to make those sorts of investments. So when an economy isn't growing, it means that something is broken. Now, whether that thing that's broken is government or market failure or something else entirely, you know, it needs investigating. And I look at these things and I look at the different types of models, and I generally conclude that the thing that's holding back growth in Hawaii is economic geography. Diversifying is about developing new industries that can offer growth. So growth is the problem. Diversifying is thought to be able to address that by offering new opportunities, because tourism is just not offering it right now. Military is kind of just dependent on the whims of government. So we need new industries to establish growth. Now, whether or not the market or governments are required to establish clusters do form on their own. They form on their own in large cities, generally. They don't tend to form on their own in isolated places. There are a few exceptions to this, say where you have a university that made an intervention and created some sort of industrial park and spun businesses out of the university. Generally, that comes from public investment. And if you look at any sort of isolated clusters that are geographically isolated clusters of tech, it's come from some sort of government intervention that caused the historical accident to then allow the market to allow that cluster to continue, right? But the cluster requires an initial push from government to get established to then let a market discovery process take place. And this is a problem because of economic geography, and it particularly applies to Hawaii because of our isolation. Now, I want to address the other theme of your arguments, the main one that governments do get it wrong. And there's many examples where the Hawaii government has got it wrong. And I don't deny that that's the case. There will be a lot of issues that the state government needs to address, including its capacity to undertake industrial policy. But markets are not a utopia. There are many failures in business. Half of businesses fail in the first 5 years. Mark Zuckerberg invested billions in virtual reality, right, at Facebook, and he even changed the company's name to Meta because he thought the metaverse was the next big thing. And the market didn't just stop him. His board finally stepped in, right? Governance of his company is what allowed a change of direction, even when someone as powerful and influential as Mark Zuckerberg was making those investment decisions. And so, of course, there are many examples of failures in government, just as there are many examples of failures in business. And neither business or the government always gets it right. But there are not many other good choices for addressing the lack of growth in Hawaii, other than a government intervention to establish a new cluster. But successful government interventions require high-quality decision-making. So this requires strong governance, transparency, accountability for both. It's essential for both governments and for businesses. Government failure doesn't mean that governments stop addressing market failures. It's an argument for better government, right? And if governments can apply similar rigorous governance to policy as businesses do, using appropriate measures of success, then they'll be able to weed out sort of those failures before they become too costly. So, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Stephen, and thanks to Seth as well. We're going to transition into a Q&A now. I'm going to be sort of asking the questions and exercising some discretion, asking, first off the questions I have for our panelists, I think. But you can also feel free to chime in the chat and, send your questions there, and I'll try and incorporate them into my conversation with the panelists as best I can. So to get started with a sort of general question, I think, we've heard some broad arguments, some specific examples were mentioned, but I'm curious if you could make things very concrete for us. What do you think would be sort of the first most important implication of the arguments that you presented? Say, Stephen, for example, you might tell us, is there a specific industry that you think is maybe sort of the most obvious one to start with, and what particular kind of intervention do you think might be warranted, or whatever you think? Again, just what's the most important first thing you might do concretely if your perspective is correct? And Seth, similarly, what's the first most important place where we might want the government to take a more hands-off approach than it's doing now? Why don't we start with you, Seth?
Yeah, I would just permitting reform. Instead of it taking 8 or 9 years to build a factory in Hawaii where people are putting the private sector is putting its money at risk, let's have it approved in 2 years, right? The cost of capital is enormously important for the potential investments, and the fact that we are delaying and driving up the driving down investment performance almost on purpose is the first thing I would remove.
Stephen? You're muted.
Sorry, I agree a lot with what you just said, Seth. You know, absolutely, the timing it takes to get permitting even to build a house is insane, and that causes, you know, our cost of housing to be enormously high. So I do actually think, yeah, one of the first things to do is that sort of planning reform. The other sort of planning reform that I would do before the sort of government intervention is a governance type reform, where you basically, all government programs need to have sort of measures of performance and constant monitoring and review for are they achieving the things that they are expected to achieve. And if they're not achieving those things, doesn't mean, it either means you're not measuring the right measure of success, or it means, and you need to change that measure, or it means you need to adjust your program, and ultimately you could abandon some of those programs, right? So we need better capacity for actually running the programs that we have already, and can do that by having stronger governance, right? In terms of what industry I think would be suitable, so my last seminar a month ago, I presented some data-driven answers to this question. The point of that was not to say that, you know, the government should even go and pick what that winner is. I actually think the ideas about what the industries are need to come from the market sector. The other people with private information, you know, that's the benefit of markets, is that it reveals that private information. But when there is a market failure, it means that those businesses or entrepreneurs are actually prevented from implementing that investment. So it's not that the government necessarily knows more, it's that the market isn't able to make use of its information. And so with a government intervention to establish a new cluster, they're seeking that information. So you would set up a policy that basically seeks proposals for, hey, what's the thing that needs addressing to establish a new industry? And there'd be certain criteria that need to be put into a policy like that.
Can I just make a quick
Go
point?
for it.
So just to point out, the first two things on Stephen's list is also less like reforming more private sector things rather than industrial promotion. And then the second thing is, like, we use the word market failure, but what is the actual market failure in the particular cluster, right? I just, if you have a great answer, I would love to hear it, but we just got to be careful every time we talk about market failure. It's like that's the one invitation that economists use to have more government, but we really, I mean, the market failure has to be like, do people not know how to invest in shrimp farming? Or like, do we need the port? You know, like, do we need cleaner water? Like, what's the missing variable here?
I want to give Stephen just a chance to briefly respond to that.
Yeah, that is a great. I'm glad you asked that question, Seth, if Dylan hadn't asked it. You know, I'm actually very careful about how I use the term market failure. And strictly speaking, some people might make the argument that this isn't necessarily a market failure. What it is that with economic geography, you end up with what's called a multi-equilibrium model. And so it's that if left to the state of the market, businesses can choose different locations, and there are different types of equilibriums that could emerge that are path dependent based on that history. And the one that we've come out in at the moment, largely because economic policy has been completely ignorant of place and space, has meant that those clusters tend to aggregate in cities, in very large cities. And right, so most of the growth in the United States has come from about 4 or 5 cities on the coasts, these superstar cities that become incredibly expensive. And so that is also eating into a lot of the benefits of those industries are providing. So even though they're providing huge value, all of that value is eaten away by the expense. And there's another potential equilibrium here, which is where you have many, many of these centers. So rather than having lots of large cities that are really diversified, you have many, many centers that are each leading in their own individual clusters. And that equilibrium could have emerged on its own if we'd had certain historical things, and there are times in history when those types of clusters happened, but we're not in that situation. We're in a different one. And to get from that situation back to this better equilibrium where you have more places that are benefiting from economic growth with less costs of, you know, large cities, as well as the benefits of clustering that are recognized, also the benefits of large cities, that requires a push from government. This was kind of the idea behind, you know, Biden's new tech centers type policy to establish new tech centers. So the type of policy that I would put forward is very similar to that type of policy, although my issue with that policy is that still left Hawaii behind. Hawaii wasn't awarded one of those tech centers, and so Hawaii is still left to just lag behind. So instead, the way I would do it is have it that you actually need the state governments themselves, the local governments, to be driving their own priorities, not federal priorities. Federal priorities are different from Hawaii's priorities. So if we're left to federal priorities, we're also not going to have a particular cluster that's established in Hawaii. We're simply going to continue to fall behind. So this requires the state government to step forward and say, these are some clusters where we expect there to be great potential, and we can put all sorts of research into doing that. And that research is not revealed by market outcomes. So in that sense, it is still a market failure. It's a market failure because it's a Pareto improvement by moving to this second equilibrium, this alternate equilibrium than where we are right now.
Okay, I'm going to jump in and just keep us moving along to some other questions. But thank you for that, Stephen. So I want to ask, I think both of you seem to, sort of acknowledge that to some extent we're being held back by certain types of so-called government failures. I think you framed it, Seth, as a sort of lack of state capacity to some extent. And also by perhaps the implications of that being that, we have particular types of policies with respect to, say, permits that are holding us back. I want to ask you, Stephen, to what extent do you think that your argument is, as Seth has suggested, undermined by the presence of those sorts of policy failures? Do you think that your argument is sort of predicated on us being able to do something to resolve that? Or do you think that your arguments are sort of valid even if we, essentially have the government that looks like the government of today and permits continue to look the way they do? And Seth, conversely, I wonder, to the extent that we make some progress on alleviating some of the state capacity issues, like imagine that happened, would you then be more sympathetic to Stephen's argument, or would you still be quite skeptical? Let's start with Seth, maybe actually, because we were just hearing from Stephen.
Absolutely. If we moved up to number 2 or 3 in the business rankings, had great permitting reform, had made it easier for people to do business in Hawaii, I'd be more than happy and wait 5 years to see what happens. I would be more than happy to revisit this discussion.
If, say, growth was, continued to be anemic or something, that would be what would convince you. Okay, that's very helpful. Stephen, can you give us your perspective?
I think Seth and I agree on a lot. Actually, remarkably here that that state capacity to do something does need addressing. But I do think even if that state capacity is addressed, federal priorities are not necessarily going to get us there to establish that. And the market is still going to be faced with this geography that even if you establish a tech business in Hawaii, it becomes very attractive to shift that tech business to California very early on, right? And I think the same applies to almost every industry, unless it's something, the types of clusters that form in distant places tend to be something that's really bound to natural resources, right? And so the things that happen in Hawaii is because of our climate, because of our scenery and so on. These are natural resources that can't relocate, right? We should be firstly, taking better advantage of our natural resources than we are. But it doesn't mean that those are the only things that we can do. And once you establish a cluster, what happens is the businesses benefit more from being in that cluster than from leaving it. And that requires a government push, even if we do address all the sort of capacity issues. Secondly, even if we don't address the capacity issues, I don't think we actually have all that much choice, because it's not that, we've already been in this situation for 30 years where Hawaii's total visitor spending hasn't been increasing, and for about 25 years, about 20 years, since 2005, Hawaii's GDP per capita, real GDP per capita, is about the same that it is now. We've already waited long enough, and if we were to wait another 5 years, that just means we fall even further behind. It actually makes the problem harder to address.
Okay, so I want to transition maybe into some more specific questions for each of you. So, but you can feel free in each case to chime in if you have something to say about it. So for you, Seth, I wonder to what extent you talked about sort of some things that are driving up the sort of cost of capital effectively for our businesses. To what extent do you think that it's worth considering something like eliminating the state corporate income tax as a way of reducing the cost of capital for local businesses? I'm aware of at least one paper which suggests that the state corporate income taxes are generally speaking too high, and including in the specific case of Hawaii. So I wonder what your perspective is on
that. Just as a caveat, I am the tax research and planning officer, so I would I need to keep a little bit of neutrality in all of this, because I grade all that legislation. My experience in working with taxes is taxes are an issue, but they're usually not the number one or number two issue facing businesses. And so what I'm really trying to argue here is like, if we're going to figure out priorities, it's not like the fact that we couldn't come up with some potential project if everything else was, if we had this super high capacity government and we had done all this permanent reform. What I'm trying to emphasize here is the case of priorities, right? And I really do not think that our business taxes are our number one problem facing businesses here.
Okay. To transition to a question that's more specifically for Stephen, and I think partially based on something I've heard from some of the audience, do you think that the sort of potential future increased reliance on remote work has any implications for your argument? Does that undermine your argument potentially in any way? You're muted again.
Remote work is something I'm actually looking into. That remote work, it turns out, actually reinforces these geography problems. So most remote work is not fully remote, it's hybrid. It's where you have to commute to work twice a week, right? And so when you have to commute twice a week, you can't be living in Hawaii and flying to San Francisco. What it means is that you can potentially live on the neighbor islands and fly to Honolulu twice a week. Or you could live on the North Shore and commute downtown for the 2 days a week that you have to be in the office. But remote work largely means that you need to be within a commutable distance. And the thing is that when you're in a small city, when you're in a relatively small place, the benefits of remote work are relatively small because it's easy to commute. There's not a whole lot of saving from that, from commuting less regularly. But when you're in a big city, there's massive savings from commuting less frequently. So the benefits of remote work are greater in bigger cities than smaller cities. What this means is it makes bigger cities more attractive than they were in the past. And so rather than remote work actually enhancing growth in smaller and distant and isolated places, remote work's actually going to reinforce and enhance growth in those very large cities. It's just going to extend it to the hinterlands of those cities where people can now commute, 3 or 4 hours from.
Okay, that's clarifying. So a related question that I have, I think, for both of you is, to what extent does the sort of possibility of brain drain, so to speak, or rather maybe a different way of putting it is the sort of mobility of people, is that important for your argument? So Stephen, one could imagine, and I think you hinted at this yourself, that one concern we might have about, say, investing in targeted education programs is that people will take that knowledge and leave. About investing in local businesses, that they'll pick up and move to California. One could imagine that that's presents a reason that we might be concerned about your argument. But on the other hand, I could imagine that it could create a challenge for Seth's argument as well. Maybe in the presence of such strong mobility effects, maybe what Stephen is saying is sort of even more important. That it could be that because we're facing such tough competition from the mainland, this sort of reinforces some sort of arguments for having government intervention of some kind. I'd be curious to hear both of your perspectives on that.
When you talk to business owners, the first thing they say is it is incredibly hard to do business here in Hawaii. If we made that easier, I'm not exactly sure if we would tip one way or the other, but what we're always talking about in economics is at the margin, right? Like the last 4 or 5 businesses and how we're going to influence those decisions. If we can lower business costs here in Hawaii, we would at least tip the scales and allow some people to remain here in Hawaii to open up businesses and to continue working. And I think that is the main, the central binding constraint that we're facing right now as a state.
Stephen?
Yeah, so I mean, is mobility, does it undermine the argument for clustering? In fact, I think it reinforces the need to have a cluster, because a cluster creates that, to establish new clusters, creates that pull factor that keeps them here, rather than the push factor or the pull factor from other places pulling them away. And mobility has its costs too. So when people move away, they don't get to live near their families in Hawaii. This is especially a problem for Native Hawaiian families that would love to be able to live in their homeland, but they're moving to the mainland because that's where they get more economic opportunities. And so we need to create more economic opportunities locally. I want to address this point though about taxes or ease of doing business. I totally agree. You don't want to completely make business really difficult or have taxes be too high. But it's also not that taxes or ease of doing business are a panacea either. If you look at the places that rank poorly on that list of ease of doing business, California and New York are right there. Yet those places are the ones that are hosting, tech hubs that are thriving, right? And so the ease of doing business or taxes is not the main decision about where businesses take place. Businesses are concerned with many, many more factors than taxes and ease of doing business. So much so that they're still being willing to sit in their clusters in Silicon Valley, despite the fact that it's hard to do business and taxes are high in California, right? But and a really good example of this is that Amazon didn't choose the place for its second headquarters based on which place gave it the lowest tax breaks. It chose Virginia because of skills, the fact that they had highly educated workforce that they could hire, and Virginia was not offering the lowest tax breaks. The place that offered the lowest tax breaks, and Kansas has gone through this reform where they had really low taxes, but it simply didn't generate the growth that they wanted.
If I could just transition, I think we're running out of time, and there's one question I wanted to close on and hear from both of you on briefly. There's always a risk when we have these sorts of discussions, I think, that we're having a discussion about something that is really about the past, and that as the world changes, by the time we've understood what just happened, new things are happening. And maybe it has implications. So I want to acknowledge, that this is a time of sort of great uncertainty potentially for a variety of reasons related to, changes that are happening at the federal level with respect to federal spending, potentially geopolitical uncertainty that could, affect Hawaii a lot, and with the sort of, progress of, new artificial intelligence technologies. There's a lot happening. And I wonder to what extent you think that the things you're saying are sort of reinforced and or undermined by how we should think about this sort of future uncertainty. And feel free to pick up on whatever aspect of that you think you have something to say about.
In a world of uncertainty, you want to give people maximum freedom to be able to adapt, to do what they need to do, and make quick choices. The best way to do that is to give people higher levels of economic freedom and lower the cost of doing business, doing things like that. So I think that strengthens my argument rather than having a prescriptive analysis about what the future will look like. So the government needs a prescriptive view of the future in order to plan for that, and it's going to take lots of years. Since we don't know how to do that, the better way is to take a more humble approach and epistemologically have some humility and allow people and businesses to react the way that they want to react, and in doing so, giving people more freedom.
Steven?
Yeah, but there is a whole lot of uncertainty in the world, and it's even more uncertain in Hawaii if you're trying to invest in an industry that isn't one of our two existing clusters of tourism and military. Right. And so because of that uncertainty, that is actually the reason for the government to step in to say, we're going to, but that uncertainty is what's forcing businesses, what's holding businesses back from investing, because they don't know if other businesses are going to show up that can fill their supply chain that are required within that cluster. They don't know if other people are going to, there's going to be a large enough pool of workers with the specialized set of skills that their industry needs. Right. And so because of that uncertainty that's in Hawaii, they tend to go to places that have less uncertainty. Right. And so the government actually has a role to address that uncertainty by making a commitment to establishing that new cluster. Exactly what that cluster is, I've tried to come up with various data-driven ways of figuring that out, and there can be different proposals put forward, but it still requires, I think, the government to make that commitment to reduce the uncertainty, and that way markets can function. Markets handle risk really well, but markets don't handle uncertainty very well.
Okay, thank you both. I think we're going to sort of bring it to a close there, but we do have a final poll that we wanted to present to see whether or not folks have changed their minds about this. Although I don't know how to start the poll, so I'm hoping Mary can help me out.
Hi, yes, Dylan. I'll go ahead and initiate the post poll.
And I apologize if I didn't address every question that came up in the chat, by the way, but I received a lot of messages. Okay, so you have a chance now to vote in the poll, and we are off to a good start. 42% already. We'll give it another 30 seconds for people to chime in. Any final, I think we had 21 responses the first time, and we have a couple more participants now. Anyone else want to chime in before we close?
So I'll just mention, like, if other questions have come up in people's minds that you're just dying to get an answer to, I'm sure both Seth and I would respond to an email. If we don't have time, then our response will be just very brief. That's all. But I'm open to receiving questions by email. If this has really sparked your imagination and you want more clarification on stuff, it's great that you're wanting to learn more.
Or if for some reason you want to know what I think. Hopefully you couldn't tell from my questions. I was trying to be unbiased. Okay, so we've got some results, and I think it looks like some folks have moved their opinion, although I don't remember exactly what the results of the first poll were, so I can't say for sure if we've had people move from yes into no, or if we just had people move from unsure into no. But in any case, it's certainly clear that we have more no's. I believe we only had 2 at the beginning, and now we've got 7. And we have 50% of people, 11 still saying that they think the answer is yes. So hopefully that is in fact because you learned something today that affected your perspective. So thanks everyone.
Thank you, Dylan, for moderating, and thank you, Stephen, for presenting some great arguments.
Pleasure, Seth. Great to have a debate.
Thank
Just
you.
as like
Sorry.
one other thing, I'm a board member, so if we're always looking for ways to have engaging events. If you did find this useful and you like this format, please, send us a note or even write in the chat. We're curious to know what works and what resonates with everybody, and just to keep people up on upcoming events. On March 19th, we have an in-person event, which is a little different. Again, it's Understanding Your Personal Economy workshop. It's more of a financial planning and a little bit more in depth. And then as always, we have the October 17th annual conference, and we're planning that, and we should have a theme within a month or 2. So we hopefully mark your calendars, and we look forward to seeing all of you guys there. Once again, thanks so much for coming and supporting HEA events, and we hope you found it useful.